A little while ago, I streamed on my channel with the intention of making it a full coloring tutorial, but the end game of the stream was to condense it into a more digestible video where all the advice was right there and skipping all my tangents and brain waves that I would have that are just very typical of me. This is that video. Now, I will be cutting in back and forth in between the stream clips because there were moments where I thought I was explaining it or was just talking nonsense the whole time and it was kind of distracting. And, just gotta speed things up and just explain to you what's going on a lot faster than it would be live. So, without further ado, take it away, Stream Rune. I use the pen tool for the coloring, even though I use the G pen for line art. Just feel like it just works better. And since the line art is mostly complete and the background is on a different layer, for the coloring layer, I can just blotch it on so that I can guarantee that it's under the line art. And then use the bucket tool, use the void option, I don't know what that's called. And then I just click and it's fully rendered. And when I zoom out, there's no like weird pixelations on the edge of the line art. Now, there is still some pixelations in between, which if it's really bothering you, you can just go through and erase that, but... Now, for any of you who are concerned about the kits being so close together and rendering all their patterns right next to each other, what I can do, and what I have done in the past, I put, even though their bases are on the same layer, I put each kit on a separate layer. Now, that's what I used to do with characters. I would have like them all on the same layer, but their colors were on different layers. But with the big cats, what I've been doing is I have cats that aren't next to each other on the same layer, but I'll put like, if the majority of them have white markings, I'll put the white on one layer, and then the markings on a different layer, and then their ears, nose, and mouth colors on a completely separate layer. Just so I know things aren't bleeding into each other, and when, like when stripes overlap patches, so when I blend out the patch, it doesn't ruin the line art of doesn't ruin the stripes. But for kits, since they're so small and they're still like kind of growing into their fur, if their patterning looks blotchy, it's fine. At least I think it's fine, unless they're a focus character. Like with Black Kit on a previous page that is already posted so I can talk about it. It was a close-up of her to show how similar she looks to her father Blackstar. So that's why I spent extra detail and extra time on making her actually look like a cat rather than a little kitten. I'll get to that later in a second. You know what? There. Sometimes it's okay to just use the bucket tool if you're losing patience. Like I am. Alright. Now that we have our base colors down, can add you know what? Hold up. Actually, hold up. Because I feel better doing it this way. When coloring a character's eyes, especially for me especially me personally, you don't have to do this, but I do suggest it if you want to notice a pop. When coloring a character's eyes, do it on a separate layer than their base colors. So that when you render and, when you shade and highlight, the eyes are on top of all that. And so the eyes don't get covered up. Now, I do it with these characters because, well, they're cats, and their eyes kind of glow anyway. But I've noticed when I do it with my other characters, putting their eyes on a separate layer, it just always guarantees that their eyes are safe from getting covered up by everything else. And I, can render them a little more than I would normally, like any flat colors, because with Past the Brighter Stars, I have like the main color, and instead of worrying about shading and lighting, I have two already selected colors that operate as their shading, as their shadow and highlight. And of course, I always draw the highlight in the pupil. And if I think it needs a little bit more pop, I just add a hard light. I go to blending, add a layer, and hit hard light, and then color over the line art with that if I think they still need a little bit of pop. Also, something I've noticed when it comes to coloring, and this is just coloring in general, it has nothing to do with comics, but it's mostly implemented in comics. You can give a character the most complex design ever, but while designing their complex design, you have to keep in mind a simplified version. So when they're really far away, like, what is the most important shape of their markings? So you're not constantly just zooming all the way in, worrying about all this tiny little detail work. And then when you zoom out, you're like, oh, all they see is a blob. I know everyone has this gung-ho personality when it comes to life whenever consequences be damned. But sometimes consequences are damning. Future you will be spitting on past you's grave if you don't consider them. Now, to save room, I think I'm comfortable enough to merge down all these layers so that she would just be a layer on top, and then when everything is done, then I'll merge it down. But sometimes when it comes to shading, especially if characters are overlapping and I don't want their shadings to blur into each other, I'll keep them separate. Like, I think I will keep them separate, because then Snowblaze will be at the under the kit, so I can give them the shade, give her her shade under the kittens, but have the kittens kind of stay on top of that so that we can still see them a little bit. But still shading them, but just not as much, to be just for simplicity's sake. So I think I will merge these down, add a new layer on top of the background line art, and get to work on Snowblaze. And then from here on out, it was just a rinse and repeat for the rest of the characters. You lay down a base color, which is like their main color, and then just keep their markings and scars and ear colors all separate on different layers. So when you blend and blur, they're not merging into each other, so you can still see them clearly, and it just makes things a little simpler so you're not constantly getting lost. Now, I don't put every single character on different layers. Like for this piece, I put Snowblaze and Ivy Whisper on the same layer because these two characters don't overlap anywhere on the page, so I could comfortably color them and keep their markings still separate via the layers and not get lost in layer hell. On some photos that I was working on, I was up to almost 150 layers because I was keeping everything separated, and it was not worth it. It was not worth it. Click and click. And with that, we are done with coloring all the characters. It only took us an hour and 40 minutes, give or take. Oh my god. Now that the hard part's over, we can completely switch streams, because during this stream, I didn't talk about the coloring process as much as I thought I did. That was a different stream, my bad. But it's the same principle across all pages, and I talk about it a little more depth in this stream near to the end of it. From the bottom up, but sometimes I'll go trees and bushes first because they're, you know, more prevalent in a scene, and while the ground is just kind of like me adding texture, me literally doing this. Because the thing with coloring that I really like, it's all about texturing. Like when some cosplay artists talk about how much they love weathering, the texturing is the weathering of illustration for me. And I'm overlapping the lines a little bit, but that's because when I'm going to put the grass on top, and then it'll overlap, and the ground will show up under the grass, and it'll just look more real, more present. If it was really hard to tell what I was doing, I'll explain it here. For the ground, I had like 3 colors that I would switch in between. I had the medium brown, a darker brown, and a lighter brown, and then I would go an eyedrop in between, like the in-between shades that would overlap, and just color over on top of each other and just switch between those like 4 base colors. And during that process, not only was I adding texture to the dirt to make it look like, oh yes, there's some particles in here, I was also kind of using it to shade where the characters were standing and what was going to be under the grass and bushes. So I wouldn't have to worry about it, the multiply later, when I could just do it with color. It's the same principle with what I do with the grass as what I do with the dirt. Pull it away from the dirt a little bit, just so it doesn't look like I've plastered it on there haphazardly, even though that's exactly what I did. But shh, you don't. The audience doesn't need to know that. As long as it looks pretty to them, they don't care how you did it. Unless you cheated, and then they will care. And I do the same thing with the bushes and the trees. If they're solid enough, I'll just use the bucket tool. And I go through just different shades of whatever. And then I add a clipping mask. And I do this one thing where I undershade. And then how did I do it last time? Then I pick a random lighter color and then place that on top. And then I go through with the actual smaller brush and then add texture between and on top of those colors. And now here's where I have to be more mindful. This is a sunset scene, so all of this coloring is going to be shaded with an orange. So their highlights are going to be more yellowy, even if the actual bush is more of a green or a blue-green, it's starting to look more yellow because that's what the sun is doing. And like I said earlier, it's the same principle with the ground, grass, bushes, and trees. I'm basically, I'd choose one base color, a darker color, and a highlight, and then just overlap each other multiple times. And sometimes I'll get in like some fourth or fifth colors that are even lighter or even darker, just so it's, I say it's me being lazy so I don't have to do the rendering with the shading later, but the way I shade is basically just changing the colors, and I'll talk about it later. But yeah, for all of the bushes, trees, grass, ground, I'm literally doing zigzag motions, or, just short brush strokes with multiple different colors and faking texture. And that's me going overboard on the bushes. Now on the trees, which I will do under these bushes because they're more focal, it's basically the same thing. Airbrush a brown or a gray or brownish gray. This is more of a red brown, depending on what kind of trees I'm thinking of. And then add a clipping mask. And back with the airbrushing. Although with the trees, I am shading more than I am rendering color. Because with trees, it's all about texture on the bark. See, two different colors, one darker, one slightly lighter, thinking about where the light is coming from. And just barely, don't heavy-hand it. Learn how to be more fluid with your wrists. So you can just, do, that because it's coming in from the side, and maybe 2 lines, and there you have a tree. Then when you zoom out, it's like, oh wow, these are perfectly rendered, not perfectly, I don't want to get too excited. These are rendered trees and ground, and look at all of it coming together. Oh, that must have taken you hours. No. I'm literally knocking it out of the park right now. I think you get the idea at this point. It's just a lot of going back and forth and zigzagging motion. So I'm going to skip to the lighting and the shading right now. Here's the line art for the background, because I separate character line art from background line art, just so it's easier. And then we're going to let's do the sunset. So we're going to do hard light. And then just put it in barely what we want it to be. Maybe a bit of red in there. Some white. And then we blur. Beneath that, I'll add another layer on multiply, which will be on a darker orangey red. And that's when I will add in all the shading. And then underneath this main lighting, I'll add the rim lighting. But still underneath the other lighting, because this is passing over, because these are rays and beams and whatnot. Even though we kind of already did it with the textures, this is just lighting and shading with a little extra color that will sit on top. Thing with the hard light and the multiply is that it's not adding on solid color. It's just making everything it touches that tint. See, because the lightish brown that I put down earlier is now showing up as bright orange. But yeah, that's how I color comics. Everything down to just silly little airbrushing a simple background to a focus shot to basically I should have been an illustrator. I mean, I kind of already am an illustrator, but this was just my coloring process for comics. If you'd like to see how I do full illustrations, because there is a little extra few steps that I add to an illustration, let me know. And I'll just talk about how I flat that, because basically Well, I won't talk about the flatting because flat colors and blocking them in, it's the same for every coloring instance I do. It's just for illustrations. I add extra filters on top, and I can talk about that if you would be interested. But yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. And if you have any extra tips and tricks that you just want to share in the comics, in the comments, wow, be sure to leave them down below. And always remember, everyone is at a different level than you, no matter age, experience, or just anything, because we all learn differently and we all have a process that we all follow. So be respectful in the comments. Be pleasant, be present, be proud. To be a princess is to be an artist. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm just I don't have official outros for my videos, so I guess I'll just see what happens next. Bye bye.